rules are not always the same. Yeah, they are employed or enforced in different manners. And so, but sports, and particularly when we're playing on the playing field, the rules are the same for everybody. And so, yeah, I think that's what you kind of saw. And so, as Buck would say, it was the hope of a young boy dreaming to play for the Kansas City Monarchs, just as it was the hope of a young kid playing for the New York Yankees. Yeah, because those were their idols. Those were their heroes. And the thing, what segregation did, Scott, was it forced you to operate within a small radius. Here in Kansas City, about a 13-block radius. Well, Satchel Paige, I don't care how much money Satchel Paige made. He lived in the same neighborhood I lived in. And Buck O'Neil. So I saw them every day, and I didn't just idolize them as athletes. I idolized them as men because I'm watching how they conducted themselves both on and off the field. And you wanted to emulate that behavior. So yeah, they were stars in this community. And you saw that wherever you had successful baseball, you saw that same thing. You know, you see Satchel walking through Harlem and kids on his coattail. You know, they wanted to touch his coattail, and because he was a big star. He was a big star, but he was also a very accessible star because you're confined into certain geographical locations, no matter how much money I may have.
What you said about most of them being college educated, I was thinking about the university system in the 1940s, and whether it was Ivy League, whether it was historically black, I think something like only 10% of the population went to college, and it might even be lower. So getting a BA back then would be like getting a master's or doctorate.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Statistically back then, the Negro Leagues must have had like the highest educated people you
could
have.
They had and even if they didn't all finish college, because in some instances these guys was, hey, this money's pretty good. I'm going to leave this and I'm going to go play baseball. But the fact that they had already started the process of educating themselves put them ahead of most people in this society. Buck O'Neil went to Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. The great Monty Irvin, who I referenced earlier, went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Larry Doby went to college. So there were any number of these guys, and they were multi-sport stars in those academic environments as well. And so, yeah, it just helps people understand that you can't always adhere to what you hear. Yeah, you know, and some of these things we have to experience for ourselves to get the true picture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of that like combination of a scholar athlete. I mean, there's not many examples because, like you said, a lot of people are prospected in high school. But I'm thinking like a Niels Bohr who wins the Nobel Prize, but it's also an Olympian. So
yeah, there's a great story of a guy named Grady Orange. Grady Orange played in the Negro League to finance his medical school and would become a medical doctor. Yeah, and there are these countless stories like that. He would be a graduate of Meharry Medical School in Tennessee. And there are these just countless stories like that.
This probably isn't right, but I'm imagining guys telling jokes to each other in Latin or ancient Greek. Probably not the case. But hey, why not? It could be. Here's something I'd love for you to touch on, and you were mentioning this before we started recording. I mean, with the Negro Leagues, number one, it's not a story just of exclusion, but they do many things to make baseball internationally popular. And baseball fans, I think they're surprised. Many people know there's a lot of players that come out of Latin America. Baseball is very, very popular in Japan.
Yes.
And I always wondered, where did that come from? And I didn't know, so I just guessed, it's probably the Marshall Plan when America was there after World War II. You were saying, no, that's not the case at all. So please, what is that story?
Yeah, no, it's not. And we talk about it in the context of how proficient the Negro Leagues were in their barnstorming. And for those who may not be familiar with that term, in this case, as it relates to baseball, they were taking baseball to towns and areas that had not seen professional baseball. And so the Negro Leagues would take baseball into Canada. They were oftentimes the first Americans to play in many Spanish-speaking countries. Believe it or not, it was indeed a touring team of Negro Leaguers who introduced professional baseball to the Japanese, going all the way back to 1927. Scott, that's about 6 years before Babe Ruth and his All-Stars visit Japan. Now,
Right.
they've been commonly credited with having taken professional baseball to the Japanese, but it's not true. No, it was a team called the Philadelphia Royal Giants who would go to Japan in 1927, play a 24-game exhibition series. They go 23-0-2. I'm sorry, they go 23-0-1 on the tour. The tour was so successful that several years later, Ruth and his All-Stars would get invited over. And I always preface that with my visitors because, as you just touched on, as we look at the game of baseball today in its global capacity, there are so many ethnicities that make up a major league roster on any given day. Mm-hmm. But at the heart of it were the Negro Leagues. They helped make the game the global game that it is today. And quite frankly, the Negro Leagues did not care what color you were. They didn't care what color you were. All they cared was, can you play? And if you can play, you can play. And so they go to Japan and they teach the Japanese. Now, the Japanese, you have to be mindful that the Japanese had already been playing ball, but they had not seen professional baseball until the Philadelphia Royal Giants go over there in 1927. And so the Royal Giants go over and they didn't try to beat them as bad as they could beat them. They taught them the game. And as a result, the Japanese fans and the Japanese players absolutely adored them. And as you well know, Japan is a country that is rich on respect. And the Negro Leagues embraced this. And so they became early U.S. ambassadors because, again, the Japanese fans absolutely adored them. They would go back on a subsequent trip to Japan. And it is the Negro Leagues that is basically credited with having jump-started professional baseball in Japan. Because when Ruth and his All-Stars go over, they made a mockery of it. They were the ones doing all the showboating and doing all this kind of stuff. And the Japanese ball players became a little bit disheartened. And here was the Negro League doing the exact opposite of what people would have believed they would have been doing. Yeah, the common belief would have been, oh, the Negro League players are going to be doing all the showboating and doing all this kind of thing. No. They were accustomed to barnstorming. The major leaguers really weren't. And so you don't ride into the town, beat the town team as bad as you can because you want to get invited back. That's a payday. But I think it took on an even deeper, richer meaning when they go into another culture and that they weren't going to disrespect that culture. And as a result, the Japanese love of baseball really emanates because of the Negro Leagues. And I should say the love of professional baseball kind of resonates because of the Negro Leagues.
For the Negro League players themselves, what was it like when they were in foreign countries? And what I'm thinking of when I'm asking this is for black servicemen in World War I and World War II, a lot of historians say that's what kicked off civil rights because they go to other nations and find, I'm accepted here in a way I'm not in my hometown.
Absolutely.
Or
it was
my
the
home
same
country.
in baseball.
So, yeah, what was it like for them?
The same in baseball. These players would go to those Spanish-speaking countries, and they were treated like heroes. They stayed in the finest hotels. They ate in the finest restaurants that those countries had to offer. And then you come back home and you're treated with such disrespect. You're subject to Jim Crow. You're unfit. And so a lot of those Negro League players would actually call those Spanish-speaking countries home because in those countries, they weren't black baseball players. They were just baseball players. So you get acceptance abroad that you weren't getting at home. And I think when we go back and look at World War II, and I do think that World War II really, if you're going to look at one single solitary event that kind of pushed for the integration of America's so-called national pastime, it would have been World War II, for the very reasons that you just mentioned, that you had these young black soldiers dying, fighting the same racism in another country that we're being asked to accept here at home. So the sentiment and the prevailing sentiment became, well, my God, if they can die fighting for their country, they ought to be able to play baseball in this country. And that's where that groundswell started, of integrating America's so-called national pastime and ultimately Jackie Robinson being handpicked from the great Kansas City Monarchs.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
And you've also talked to that it wasn't only black players. There were Latino players, female players.
Hell, even some white players that played. So it literally opened its doors.
That's really got it. Yeah. What? When I read that, I thought, okay, well, yeah, so please explain that.
Yeah, no, there were a few white players. Eddie Klepp being the first who pitched for the Cleveland Buckeyes in 1946. And then after integration, Double Duty Radcliffe, the great Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, who was managing in Chicago, decided that he would try to sign some white players because they were losing their fan base to the major leagues. Mm-hmm. So he thought if he signed some white players, maybe he could get white fans to come back to the Negro Leagues. Of course, it didn't work. But so there were a handful of white players that played in Negro Leagues. But again, if you were good enough and you were white, you played in the major leagues. But the Negro Leagues basically opened its door to any person of color. It had 3 women to play professionally in the Negro Leagues, in Toni Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Peanut Johnson. They were pioneers, women who competed with and against the men in the 1950s in the Negro Leagues. You had female leaders, executives, owners in the Negro Leagues, most notably Effa Manley, who she and her husband, Abe Manley, owned the Newark Eagles, but it was Mrs. Manley who ran the day-to-day operations of that baseball team. She knew the business of baseball as well as any man. Great talent play for her. My dear friend, the late great Monty Irvin, Larry Doby, Leon Day, Willie Wells. These guys are all in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. The great Don Newcomb, who we sadly lost last year, should be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. All played for Effa Manley's Newark Eagles. She's the first woman to be nominated and inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. So this was a very pioneering league. It gave women an opportunity to do things in this country before this country gave women an opportunity to do things. And I find it so interesting and so inspiring, driving force, that here's a league change in this country born out of here's a league born out of exclusion that becomes one of this country's most inclusive entities ever. Yeah, and that's why I tell people that for me, the Negro Leagues embodies the American spirit, unlike any story in the annals of American history. Yeah, it really is. And so while America was trying to prevent them from sharing in the joys of her so-called national pastime, it was actually the American spirit that allowed them to persevere and prevail. And I think that's why, again, the story is so triumphant in nature, so awe-inspiring, so compelling for the thousands of people who are being introduced to this story through the work that we're doing here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of which, there's so many stories of players, but one I'd like to focus on is Buck O'Neil, because we're sitting here in Kansas City probably because of him.
Yeah, and he's looking over our shoulder right there.
So I don't know where to start, but yeah, I'd love to hear Buck's story.
Well, I tell you what, Buck was one of the most amazing human beings, I think, to ever walk the face of this earth, who just happened to be a great baseball player. I tell people all the time, most of us who fell in love with Buck O'Neil, we never saw him play. We fell in love with the Buck O'Neil who told us about the heroes of the Negro Leagues. More importantly, we fell in love with the Buck O'Neil who I think so beautifully and vividly demonstrated to all of us that you could indeed get further in this life with love than you could with hate. That's the Buck we fell in love with. Many of us met him through the epic Ken Burns documentary on baseball. And Buck O'Neil literally stole the show. As I tell people all the time, Ken introduced Buck to America. And here was this very charming, gentle man telling these wonderful stories about baseball to baseball fans that they had never heard. And he did it with a twinkle in his eye and a smile that lit up the screen. And America fell in love with Buck O'Neil. He was 82 years young at that time, when most of us are shutting it down if we're blessed to get to be 82. It jettisoned a whole new career for Buck, and God blessed him that he lived for another 12 years where he literally was gallivanting